We have our second Homes and Neighborhoods panel focusing on heightened scrutiny of parents and households in minority neighborhoods. Thank you.
Hello, I want you to take a few minutes to introduce the panelists to you, and then something has to happen.
Do we press the button?
I mean, that one. All right. Usually the biggest one is the right one. Okay, hi everyone. I want to take a few minutes to introduce you to our panelists, and then we'll move on to what you came here to do, which is to hear from the panelists. The first panelist is Erin Cloud, who is a supervising attorney and team leader at the Bronx Defenders, a holistic public defense office located in the South Bronx. She specializes in family defense, representing men and women entrenched in the child welfare system. She's published articles and given lectures on the racial disproportionality of the child welfare system and its impact on Black and brown women and children. In collaboration with the Greater Fight for Reproductive Justice for all women of color, she works with Black Mamas Matter to increase equity in maternal outcomes for all Black women. She's a graduate of Emory University in Atlanta and Fordham Law School. Next, we have Ubaldo Fernandez, who is a housing attorney and clinic supervisor at the East Bay Community Law Center. He represents tenants in unlawful detainer actions and supervises Berkeley law students completing their clinical education at the center's housing clinics. Previously, Ubaldo worked as a staff attorney at California Rural Legal Assistance, where he litigated housing and education cases, and as a Bridge Fellow at the Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center, where he represented workers facing discrimination based on their immigration status, language, and national origin. Since 2015, Ubaldo has served as a commissioner on the City of Oakland's Housing, Residential Rent, and Relocation Board, which adjudicates appeals of landlord-tenant disputes under the Oakland rent and eviction control laws. Ubaldo is also a lecturer at Berkeley Law School, where he teaches a course entitled Housing, Law, and Crises. Next, we have Tracy Green, who has been a practicing attorney for 20 years. If you look at her, I think she started when she was 12.
Today's my birthday,
Is it really? Happy birthday. I did a double take. I'm thinking, is that a typo? 20 years. She has extensive experience in the areas of child protection, family law, and criminal law. Tracy served as managing attorney and legal director for the Detroit Center for Family Advocacy from July 2009 to July 2016. At the beginning of her professional career, Tracy also worked as a foster care caseworker, first for the Children's Center of Wayne County, and then for the state of Michigan. Tracy is a published author in the Michigan child welfare arena. She wrote Navigating Murky Waters, Handling Unadjudicated Parent Cases, Post-Sanders, which is a widely regarded seminal authority for the application of the landmark Henry Sanders decision in child welfare law, which declared Michigan's one-parent doctrine unconstitutional. In 2010, Tracy was honored by the Michigan Supreme Court's Foster Care Review Board at its first Parents Attorney of the Year Award recipient. So join me in welcoming all of our guests. They have a variety of expertise, and we're going to tap into that and take advantage of all of it. I want to begin by asking the panelists what is the most urgent problem facing minority households or minority neighborhoods today?
I guess it's starting with the senior, right? Well, I think what I refer to as family disruption is most urgent, and what I'm specifically referring to is the disruption that not just the traditional or nuclear family suffers, but the extended family and relatives included in that family description as well, when children are removed and placed in foster care. And I'm not making a statement about whether the disruption is something that occurs if they're unnecessarily removed, because oftentimes they are necessarily removed. But I'm talking about just the removal itself being so disruptive. And I think that it's urgent, not necessarily because of the numbers, because frankly, I don't have numbers, but I can tell you that because so many people in our community broadly don't know what goes on in foster care and don't know what the foster care process and systems do to families, they don't talk about it. And when you don't talk about something, it doesn't get addressed. So without belaboring that point, I think that it's insidious that way, the negative effects. And, you know, we know about substance abuse and criminality and homelessness and mental illness and how they disproportionately affect minority communities, but foster care impacts all of those ills. So I think that we really need to take a really close look at that family disruption and all of the aftermath that it causes.
I mean, I think that you said it greatly and wisely. I would absolutely agree that that is an urgent matter, and I'm just going to kind of expound upon it. I mean, when a child's removed from a home in New York City, the family loses their home very often. They're outside of the family composition, which means you're outside of your PA budget. If you don't have that child on your PA budget, that means that you are not eligible to continue to stay in a NYCHA home because you cannot pay that rent any longer because the subsidy doesn't allow you to stay there. If you're in a shelter, that means your family gets displaced from a family shelter, so you're in a single woman's shelter. If your child is returned back to you, you're not necessarily placed back into that same home. So imagine being a child being removed for a month and then back into a home, but then all of a sudden, because you're not in the same neighborhood, you're no longer in the same school. It takes about 30 to 45 days to get that child back on the budget, which means that a family doesn't have 30 to 45 days of income to support that child in that home. So that child is now 30 to 45 days without food, without access to adequate medical care. And so it's a spiraling effect people don't really consider. It also impacts the parent's future ability to have a job and support that family moving forward. And these are in the scenarios where children are returned in short-term removals, which there is a lot of short-term removals where children are removed and returned within 3 months to a home that have an enormous impact. And I think that you are correct by stating that the urgency is that people don't know. So if you're not even having the conversation, if you don't even know, how can we possibly be fixing something that's happening amongst all communities?
I just interject very briefly. As was stated, I've been in this area combined for 25 years. I learned this week that a parent who has been placed on central registry is disqualified for public housing or for Section 8 assistance. And that is huge for minority families in particular, because minority families are disproportionately poor.
And just to clarify, for people who don't know, at least in New York, I'm not sure how it works exactly. In Michigan, the registry is when a phone call is made stating that you believe that someone is neglectful or abusive. It's just, its basis is belief. And the way to kind of understand it, it's like an arrest standard. It's the lowest threshold of proof. And if your case is indicated, which is there's some credible evidence which is based on a single caseworker's determination after a visit to a home, your name will stay on the state central registry in New York until your youngest child turns 28, barring you the ability to work in fields of childcare, fields of medical, nursing, with any type of infirm population, which for our clients is incredibly important because very often a large job for them is being a home health aide. That's how they are able to support their families. It's a job that doesn't require a lot of additional training that they can do, and it stops until their youngest child turns 28. And there is a separate process, an appeals process, but it is a very tedious and time-intensive and a lot of it's very difficult for people to get their names removed from this registry, and it stops them from also being able to be a foster parent or be a legal guardian for their children in the future. So if the foster care pipeline continues, they also cannot care for their own family. But when she's talking about this registry, it's not because someone has ever necessarily been adjudicated neglectful or abusive. It's simply a minimal probable cause standard based on a single determination of one caseworker.
I think I would definitely piggyback off of this idea of disruption. That is a major problem in housing and eviction specifically. And Tracy and Aaron have already talked about, what effects this has on a family when it's disrupted. I'd like to talk a little bit about what underlies all of that and what allows society to disrupt these families so much. And in the housing context, it has to do with another theme that they brought up, which was a failure to talk about these issues and a failure to talk about these historical precursors and how we even got here. And recently, there's been a lot of writing on this issue. There's The Color of Law is out by Richard Rothstein. Before that, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, excellent article, very concisely making the point of how wealth has accumulated primarily in white families in America. In 2011, the average white family in America had a wealth of $111,000 compared to about $8,000 for a Hispanic family, $7,000 for a black family. And this has all been by design. It has been ingrained in our institutions and our government decisions, and has caused the separation of communities, a physical, geographical separation in our communities, where we have come to lack understanding and compassion for those people who do not live in our communities and who we do not see day to day. And we have come to forget that a lot of this accumulation of wealth and the result of this accumulation of wealth has led to this constant disruption in families. And I can get into the specifics a little bit more later, but it involves from the 1930s to the 1960s, families in America going from owning 30% of families owning homes in the 1930s to 60% of families in America owning homes in the 1960s. And that has to do with FHA loans, which essentially subsidize housing for white families due to redlining policies of the FHA. And then in more recent history, the foreclosure crisis greatly affecting minority families who were targeted with subprime loans by banks such as Wells Fargo and Bank of America, and resulted in people who were eligible for prime loans being sold subprime loans. And as a result, blacks and Hispanics had higher rates of defaults on foreclosures. And that was a huge transfer of wealth from poor people in our communities to wealthy people in communities, and it still exists in our institutions now. In the mortgage interest deduction, which allows families to to deduct taxes on their first and second home. Nothing similar to that exists for tenants. And notably, the US government forgives more in taxes through the mortgage interest deduction, approximately 4 to 5 times more through the mortgage interest deduction. 4/5 of that going to families that make $200,000 a year or more. Forgives 4 to 5 times more in the mortgage interest deduction than the government uses to fund subsidized housing. So it's a big giveaway to families at the wealthiest levels of our society, as opposed to the subsidies that we're giving the people who need it most, and who need it most because of historical reasons.
So this is not going to be a session that makes you feel good. We're going to tackle some thorny problems here. So I've just been making notes on some of the issues that you guys have raised as the most pressing problem, and it brings to mind a book that was published recently by sociologist Matt Desmond called Evicted, in which he argues that we should think about eviction and the consequences of that condition as similar to being incarcerated, right? In that when you're incarcerated, once you're released, you're not eligible for housing voucher in many cities, right? It's very difficult to maintain guardianship of your children. It's very difficult to get a job if you have been saddled with a felony, right? So there's sort of overlapping consequences in both of those conditions. And I'm wondering if you guys could say more about, I should add, the book Evicted received a National Book Award. It's gotten a lot of attention both within sociology and among lay people. But prior to that book, we didn't hear very much, as you guys were suggesting, about what happens to people who are very poor in terms of their housing options. Mm-hmm. Could you guys say more about why that is? Is it that as a society, we really don't care about the poor? Is it that the issue appears to be too overwhelming and hard to get our hands around? Or is it that we don't really believe that poor people deserve nice housing, right? Or that poor people deserve to be homeowners? Or is it something else? Could you say a little bit about why you think we've been so inattentive to these very urgent problems facing poor?
I think it's all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there are some additional reasons, but even those who do care about the poor, again, the conversations among people who are not poor about mm-hmm. the poor are very limited. I mean, mm-hmm. we have them in these contexts mostly, mm-hmm. but people who are not poor don't typically talk about the poor in their homes and in their communities. So even if they care about the poor, they're not really thinking about solutions and how to address the problems that plague the poor. And as far as people not caring, well, there are always going to be people who don't care. I happen to be, despite my line of work, pretty optimistic about people. I think that most people are caring and decent, even when they don't necessarily want to show that they are. You know, that's where you get that anonymous giving thing, you know. But I think that when people do care, but they understand that the problems are so complicated, they don't want to get involved or don't make an effort to get involved because it's overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
When I could speak about New York City in a clustered urban environment, and what I will say is when you're thinking about why people don't care about poor families being evicted, is because I think that housing is aggressive to wealth. Because in order to actually give people homes, you need to give up your own space for people to have those homes. Where in New York, what they do is when people are evicted, they're clustered into shelter systems, which in New York City, we have a chronic homelessness problem where people are in shelters for 5 to 6 years before they're able to have housing. In a place like the South Bronx, which is being gentrified in an enormous rate, we have a lot of barren land due to the fact that, you know, go into history in the 1970s, the Bronx is burning. And what they have built there are almost no low-income housing that could actually mitigate the 5-year timeline to get a low-income home. They're building middle-income housing. They're addressing the need of middle America in New York City and not low-income America. And for middle-income America, they would have to give up those spaces in the South Bronx to make space for poor people. That puts those two economic demographics at odds with their own interests. And so it's not like I can just say, oh, here's some food, or here's some good thoughts, here's some blessings. Housing is actually an economic right for people that requires an actual shift in how you spend money, which is money that people don't necessarily want to give to the poor.
I would go back to this failure to talk about the historical issues, but also the ongoing issues in housing. I think that failing to talk about kind of like the historical creation of wealth and the disparity in wealth, the failure to talk about, for example, the civil procedure. I mean, who talks about civil procedure? I hate talking about civil procedure. And in most states, a tenant has to go through a general civil lawsuit, which could take years, in order to sue their landlord for a breach of contract. If the landlord fails to do any of their obligations under their lease or under the law. By contrast, a landlord may sue a tenant in a summary eviction procedure, which can take as little as weeks, in some states even days, before the tenant has to be in court for a trial after they have been served. So we don't talk about that, and we don't know that, and we don't talk about these institutions, and it allows us to feed this narrative that there are some people who are of lower quality. There are some people who are lazy and whose parents were lazy and over the course of generations have not accumulated wealth the way that other families who have been prudent and intelligent and educated have done. And it allows us to support, to make a societal judgment that this preservation of wealth and perpetuation of this wealth is more important and comes before the rights of our communities, or before our stated values as a society of equality, of opportunity, of these communities to be vibrant and healthy and diverse. So I think it really comes back to that, and that is what allows us to make these decisions or to tolerate these facts in our communities that seem absurd. For example, that in Oakland, where I practice law, a minimum wage worker would have to pay 112% of their income in order to pay for a one-bedroom apartment. Or that a teacher on a starting salary would have to pay 73% of their income in order to have a one-bedroom apartment. Or it allows us to look the other way when between 2000 and 2010, in the city of Oakland, which is known for its black history, 25% of its black residents left the city of Oakland because they couldn't afford to live there anymore. And 17% of families with children left Oakland during that same period of time. So I would say that it's this failure to talk about the issues and recognize the issues, and bring people in from other segments of society who are typically not engaged.
So, Waldo, you're suggesting that part of the reason that we, as a society, are failing to provide stable housing to lower income residents is because of this wealth disparity, right? Differences in wealth accumulation, and we see that manifest in people's ability to find a home, to maintain that home, to fight a landlord who has considerably more resources typically than tenants do, to be able to win in that instance. Is this a problem of, well, let me rephrase that. Are these problems unique to minority households, or are we really talking about social class or the intersection of the two?
Yeah, it's hard to separate them, in my opinion. But yes, we are talking about low-income people. It is not an accident of history that they are minorities.
Would you like to say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Oh, just the stuff that I already said about, the historical underpinnings of wealth generation, and then the continued institutions that perpetuate that that disparity in wealth accumulation. Like I already mentioned, the mortgage interest deduction, the rest of the tax code, low wage, the fact that we have low wage workers, the fact that all these things.
You want to jump in here?
Oh, I mean, I think that we're here because the reality is people aren't talking about poor black people, poor Hispanic people. No one, it's not an accident. That is purposeful. Our history is not something that people are interested in reconciling with. They're definitely not interested in reconciling how they have created mass systems that have put people into long-term homelessness and chronic homelessness. They're not interested in seeing how that impacts communities of children who are bounced back and forth between schools because they're bounced back to different shelters. And in a place like New York City, that is a progressive city, you can shelter, you can literally ignore those issues because they have pushed everyone into shelter systems, and therefore many people don't believe we have the same homelessness issue because you don't see people sleeping on the streets. And so they have created this Band-Aid solution that only is a solution insofar as it shields people from reckoning with it on a day-to-day basis. And that's simply in my opinion, I think what we're all saying is that the failure to talk about it is the failure to reckon with it, which is not a mistake.
And for instance, from the foster care perspective, most people don't know that the same agency that is charged with providing services to parents and caregivers from whom children have been removed for reunification is also the agency in most instances that will handle the adoption of those children should the parents' rights be terminated. And coincidentally, the agency gets a lot more money for the adoption than it does for providing services to families while the child is technically in foster care. And more often than not, the children can be placed with their relatives, but because their relatives are also poor, too frequently, those children aren't placed with relatives, they're placed with licensed foster parents, and that helps to perpetuate what I really see as akin to systems making money off of the sale of children. And there was a time in our history where that was actually the law. I don't want to be hyperbolic or seem hyperbolic, but I honestly don't see any other instance in our experience here in America where people make money from the transfer of children from their family home to a different home, a strange home, other than in slavery. And it's not purposeful. I would never go that far. But the effect is still the same. When I can't tell you how often I've had absolutely desperate grandparents who were taking wonderful care of their grandchildren because they had a daughter or a son who couldn't care for them for whatever reason, who call me because they can't get approved by the agency to continue to raise that same child for reasons that have nothing to do with the child's safety. And it always winds up that child ends up with the agency's licensed foster parent, where the agency makes money off of the child's placement. And it just spirals. The family's disrupted, they lose their home. Children who grow up in foster care are disproportionately homeless, incarcerated, and among the mentally ill population, no matter whether they were removed and placed in foster care because their home environment really suggested that they wouldn't be safe. Because foster care is there for a reason, and unfortunately, we don't have another system for protecting children. We did something before foster care, and I think that was when the community kind of wrapped its arms around children and just made sure that everybody was okay. But at some point, we decided that foster care was the way that we want to go. But it's not always for the sake of the child's safety, which is supposed to be the reason that children are removed. Too often, someone, as you just described, a singular worker decides that it's in the child's best interest. Maybe well-meaning, but it has nothing to do with the child's safety. And foster care is supposed to be a last resort kind of break the glass situation where you cannot abide the outcome if the child remains in care relative to the child's safety. But the vast majority of cases that I've seen, children are removed and they stay way too long for reasons, or they stay way too long for reasons that have nothing to do with their safety. And people are making money off of it. Organizations are making money off of it.
And just to kind of shed light or connect it to this idea of housing and spaces, you have to understand that many places terminate rights because people are not able to find stable housing. A parent's not able to find stable housing. So let's talk about this grandparent who wants to take care of their grandchild when their son or daughter is struggling through some type of crisis that makes them maybe not ready right this moment to take care of their child. That grandparent will call me and say, you know, I really would love to take care of my grandchild while your client is going through XYZ. But they told me my house was too small. Because once foster care gets involved, they then say that there are guidelines and policies and space guidelines to determine whether or not a child can be with family. So if you're poor, you're not going to meet those guidelines, number one. Then you have my client who's trying to get that child back who maybe had a Section 8 voucher. They're not renewing Section 8 vouchers, not giving new Section 8 vouchers. We call them the golden ticket. Once you've got a Section 8 voucher, you do everything you can to keep it. And for people that are low income, especially in New York City, this is their transfer of wealth. New York is not a place where people are going to purchase homes. A lot of the transfer of wealth is through succession of rentals and through your ability to pass on a Section 8 voucher, which is what my clients can do. If your children are removed from you and then they are off your budget, and then they're off your composition for your Section 8 voucher, and you are targeted by that landlord because they are annoyed that ACS keeps coming into this building, and they want to get you out, and they want to get their Section 8s out of that home, what happens is that you're going to get kicked out. Then how are you going to get your kid back? You now no longer have a voucher. You may get a transfer voucher. No landlord is going to receive your transfer voucher because landlords routinely say to our clients they will not take a client with, they will reject for pretextual reasons, and then our client loses their Section 8 voucher, their only way of having a stable home, and now they're thrust into homelessness. How are they going to be able to get this kid back? Now their focus is, do I go to a single woman or single man shelter, risk the fact that, you know, I might be raped there, I might be assaulted there, I might be existing in a lot of issues, do I sleep on the subway and then risk getting ticketed on the subway, and then having a criminal case for being on the subway, all while I'm supposed to be doing all these services to reunify with my child. And by the way, my mom couldn't take my kid because her space was too long, so I'm fighting against a stranger foster care agency at this time because you deemed my family's home insufficient. That's a problem. And people aren't talking about that.
And it has nothing to do with the safety of the
It has nothing to do with the safety of the kids.
I'm wondering, given what you guys have said, I'm wondering to what extent the state's decisions about whether a child should be removed, and if so, where should that child go, has more to do with our privileging of a middle-class ideology than anything else. I'll give you an example. Years ago, before I came to Ann Arbor, this was maybe in the 1990s, there was an adoption case that made national news. There was a couple who lived in Ann Arbor who had adopted a baby, and I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but I think what happened is that the birth mother had not informed the father that she was pregnant and offered the child up for adoption, and when the biological father found out, he wanted the baby back. And the couple who had adopted her was a middle-class Ann Arbor couple, and the biological family appeared to be a working-class family. And that case really divided Ann Arbor in a lot of ways, at least as it was described in the national news. And I think it was the Ann Arbor couple who had adopted the child who really got the benefit of the doubt here. And I mean, we might argue, well, there's some extenuating circumstances. They already had the kid physically in their home, right? But I think we can't ignore the fact that there is an underlying assumption that this kid, all kids would be better off if they could be raised by middle-class people in a house where every kid has their own room, as opposed to in a working-class family where you may have to share a room with your sister. And I think some of that bleeds into the decisions that foster care workers make, and there's really no evidence to suggest you're going to be a better person if you grow up in your own room versus sharing a room with a sibling. I mean, it really is absurd, but those kinds of considerations really underlie a lot of our thinking about what's quote unquote best for a child.
And what, I think that the fact that we assume that a child is better off if they have more stuff is a really big problem, because when children are in foster care, even if the parents, the reason that they were removed from the parents no longer exists, if they haven't complied to a certain level with the court's order, which is usually an adoption whole cloth of the agency's recommendation for services, the same agency that has a financial interest in not reunifying. So even if the situation is now changed and the child could go back for safety reasons, the child doesn't go back because they haven't complied with the service plan adopted by the court. And then there's a determination as to, and well, is it better off, is the child better off, is it in the child's best interest to terminate anyway? So those considerations, I think improperly, are made at that juncture, because best interest should never even be a consideration between determining whether a child is going to remain with family or be raised by strangers. Well, more aptly, I should say, be raised by family or be taken by the state. It should never be a consideration of best interest, because we're all going to have a different understanding or opinion about what best interest is. It really has to be a substantial risk of harm to the child's standard before we start disrupting these families. Otherwise, you have children, to your point, I remember that case very well. And to your point about that case, what people don't know and what they don't talk about in the media is that when children know that they have been adopted, not just through foster care, but generally, when they know they've been adopted, they start yearning at some point for their biological kin. They do that in almost every instance. And it doesn't mean that they want to leave their adoptive homes, but it has something to do with their need to understand who they are. It fosters a sense of self just for them to have some idea of what their biological family is like. And so often, those same foster care placements that have completely destroyed the biological family are instances where children wind up not even remaining in that new home. They become teenagers and they leave and they start acting out, and committing crimes and doing drugs, and to the point that I was making earlier about the disproportionality of children who are in foster care with all of these vulnerable populations. And I mean, I'm not a social scientist or a psychologist, so I can't say for certain that it is because their heads all messed up. But I think it's because their heads all messed up, because they don't have any idea of who they are and even whether they're not with their family because they shouldn't be with their family.
I mean, child welfare is a fascinating area of the law, because you have a living human being that is another liberty interest than your client. And so when you are always talking about two bodies, at least, and what's the best for those two bodies, your client, the mother or the father, or the mother and the father, plus the child. And so it's something that strikes a lot of emotion in people, because there may be people here who have experienced being adopted. There may be people here who have adopted. And you can never say to anyone what is the right or wrong answer for the adoption of a child, because we could never test a child both ways, right? We can't say, let's adopt them out, and let's keep them with their family, then let's see what happens, and now we know the right answer. But what we do know is that the end results of what happens when children are in foster care is a foster care to prison pipeline. We do know that the majority of adoptions really do result in some form of a broken adoption. And so there should be an urgency in trying to connect people back to their biological family. And in New York City and in most states, when your rights are terminated, you are legally dead to your child. You have no right to visit them. You have no right to see them. You have no right to hold them. You are then considered a stranger, which is a crazy idea and not a universal idea. In New Zealand, they don't do that. There's no termination. There's no concept of that. And if people were outside the foster care system, that would seem ridiculous. In the private family law arena, you have custody arrangements. You don't kill off a parent because you think the mother is better than the father or the father is better than the mother. They don't become a stranger because we have an acceptance that there is an idea that children should be raised among these situations. And if you believe that, and you may, that living in a place where there's more stuff, there's private schools, there's a larger home, is a better environment for children, guess what? You can give a poor parent more stuff. It's an easy fix. I was just looking at this email because one of my colleagues subpoenaed the foster care records about how much money this foster care parent was receiving to raise this child. And the number was staggering. It was $152,618.30 for 1 year. Wow. Not including respite services, which is when she goes on vacation, someone to watch the child for vacation, not including B2H, which is Bridges to Health, which is a supportive wraparound support network that takes children out to the movies, provides them tutoring, for 1 year. I guarantee you, if you cut a check for $150,000 to one of my clients, they could make it happen too.
Definitely,
I can make it happen.
I'd like to pick up on this idea of giving a poor parent more money because in the housing context, it kind of is about societal values and political will and how do we spend the money that we have. And so my co-panelists were talking about Section 8 housing and how it's the golden ticket. And it is. 1 in every 5 families that qualifies for a Section 8 housing choice voucher receives it in the US. So for example, in Oakland where I practice, there is a wait list to receive a Section 8 voucher. How do you get on this wait list? Well, every 5-6 years or so, they open a lottery for the wait list where people can submit their applications. Typically, the Oakland Housing Authority, I think the last time they opened it in 2011, they received somewhere around 100,000 applications for 8,000 spots. So if you win the golden ticket, then you get to be in line. And clearing that line will take 5 or 6 or 7 years. And so a lot of it really does come down to, is there the political will to give low-income people as a class more money from society, the way that we give it to people who own 2 homes. And I think that is really central to all this. And with respect to the heightened scrutiny of parents and homeowners parents in homes, this also comes into play a lot in the Section 8 voucher. Once you have the voucher, you ought to do everything you can to hold on to that voucher. And tenants do, but it is increasingly difficult, especially in places where housing is competitive. Matthew Desmond in Evicted writes about how the Section 8 voucher in places like Milwaukee often results in windfalls to landlords because the amount of the voucher is determined by HUD-determined fair market rents for some area. And it turns out, if you have a voucher, you're supposed to be able to use it to live in any private rental. But it's very difficult for a poor person, for a person of color to walk into a community of opportunity and rent a home, even if they have a voucher that guarantees that the great majority of that rent will be paid. And so what ends up happening is that Section 8 voucher holders will still kind of accumulate in low-income neighborhoods, but because the rent that HUD is willing to pay is determined on a larger area basis, then landlords can charge more than market rent. In places where housing is more competitive, like Oakland and the Bay Area, it is extremely difficult. I mean, the fair market rents are substantially below, the HUD-determined fair market rents or payment standards are substantially below the actual market rents in the neighborhoods. And so if you have a Section 8 voucher, it's incredibly difficult to use it. And if you say you just got off this wait list after having won the lottery and waiting for 7 or 8 years, if you receive the voucher but you cannot find a place to use it, a home to use it within, I believe it's 60 or 90 days, I often forget, then you lose that voucher. You can apply for one extension and you lose that voucher, and then you're out on your own again. And if you do start a tenancy, the requirements for starting that tenancy are incredibly difficult. Within those 60 days, you have to find a place that will rent to you. You have to have it inspected by the housing authority, which will determine whether this place is habitable. Definitely a protection that is worth having, but one that has significant effects on people, because oftentimes people will find homes but cannot use a voucher because the home will not pass the inspection. If it does pass the inspection, you start a tenancy in a home. You can lose the voucher at any point if you're evicted, if you fall behind on rent. You have to submit recertification of your income every year. If someone leaves your home for any reason, then you have to notify the housing authority. If you fail to do that, then you could lose the voucher. If your income goes up and you don't report it immediately, you could lose. And there are all kinds of reasons for losing the voucher. So it's incredibly difficult to hold on to, even when you have that subsidy. And Matthew Desmond, in an epilogue to his evicted book, talks about ways that the Section 8 voucher could be reformed.
So we've put a number, well, not we've, our panelists have put a number of issues onto the table. There are problems with the HCV program, right? Both in gaining access to the program by getting onto the wait list, and also in finding a landlord who will accept your voucher, because they're free to reject it. So that also complicates your ability to find affordable housing. We've talked about how, indirectly, we've talked about how the state's decision to level public housing in one city after another, Chicago gone, Atlanta gone, Richmond, tiny old Richmond, Virginia, where I'm from, the housing projects are being leveled, right, and replaced with these vouchers, which the state thinks work so well, but we're hearing from our panelists possibly don't. In New York, many of these residents are ending up in shelters instead of in stable housing. We've talked about the role of foster care workers, social workers, in actually contributing to family disruption rather than stopping it, right? So we have a number of issues that all intersect with a person's ability to find stable housing. I want to shift our focus in the few minutes that we have remaining to solutions. What do we do? Where do we start? And should our solutions be focused on policy, or should they be focused on some of the cultural disparities that we see among minority families, or maybe some combination of both?
So I think as far as solutions go, I think there are a number of solutions I can say specifically in New York that would mitigate some of the disruptions to families as it relates to housing and what's happening to them. First and foremost, there should be the ability for, if your child is removed from your care and the goal is still reunification and coming back to your care, you should be able to maintain your housing. You should not have to lose your voucher. You should not have to be able to lose the money that goes into that apartment. It should stay consistent. If the goal, which for most families in New York is about 15 months, so at least for that time period, you should not be able to be evicted simply because you are planning for your children to come back into your home. Second, that should be also an equal right within the shelter system. In New York, we have two different paths in our shelter system. We have a path placement, which is a family shelter system, and we have a single individual placement. Within 30 days, if your children are removed or not returned to you, and that's a discretionary 30 days that you have to advocate for, it's normally 3 days, you're not able to stay in that path shelter. Again, if you are working to reunify with your family, you should be able to continue to stay in that placement. If not, if you don't care about poor and Black and brown women and men, you should at least care about the children who are being moved to different places. I implore you to care about those Black men and women. I truly do, because those children will grow up and become Black men and women. But even if you cannot, or if people are not willing to, they should at least be sensitive to the fact that children deserve to go to the same school and be in the same neighborhood and have the same friends and live in the same environment, regardless of what class or race that they are, which they cannot. More broadly, there's never going to be real change until people really interrogate the racism, the sexism, and classism that define how people are organized in communities, which is what, when you're looking at family structure, really means. Where we put certain families and how we design and how we determine how families are organized says a lot about us as a society. When I love this kind of marriage between looking at housing and family together, because to me, marriage is this concept of what we have decided are our social mores and norms in society, which really is a lot about family law, with who we are as a capitalist society, which a lot is surrounded in housing, right? Because that's where your money is. That's how you're organizing people. That's where you're deciding where communities will fit. And many people really just don't know. And that's something we can all do better to improve creating better and more community-centered solutions for these issues.
We started off talking about how a lot of these problems exist and continue because we don't talk about these issues. And because we have these cultural and geographical barriers, I would say that one way culturally to get at these problems is to start breaking those barriers down. And by that I mean have the awkward conversations that everyone is shying away from these days. Have those awkward conversations with people who disagree with you. And I'm not saying shame people, but I'm also not saying make them feel comfortable. Just make them feel slightly uncomfortable in a way that meet them where they are and make them feel slightly uncomfortable in a way that will allow everyone in the conversation to grow. If you are a professor or a lecturer, have your students go into these communities, see these communities, bring people from these communities into your class to talk about their experiences. In my class, I'm having the judge that presides over all the evictions come into my class and speak to the students. I'm having some of my clients that I've defended from evictions come in and talk about their experiences. On a broader level, it's a more difficult conversation to have about policy. I mean, there are very specific things with respect to subsidized housing, with respect to that we can do. I mean, most of them involve, I can tell you what Matthew Desmond proposes, which is that, the housing choice voucher should be funded more broadly, that rent control should be mandated as part of that. Importantly, that anti-discrimination statutes should be extended to cover Section 8 voucher recipients, which some states, I believe Oregon has already done. In California, there are a few cities that have already done this, including Berkeley and Santa Monica, so that those vouchers can actually be used. Yeah, that's what I've got.
Well, I don't have a specific solution, but I would say that, well, I do have a specific solution. It was really something that you said, Aaron, that triggered this thought. And I think you may have specifically said it, or you alluded to the fact that when children are removed from their homes, the family loses income. And just to be certain that people understand what the actual mechanism is that many poor families are receiving public assistance. And in Michigan, I can't speak for other states, but in Michigan, you can't get cash benefits, which is the only way that you can pay rent. You can't pay rent with a bridge card, which is now how food benefits are distributed rather than food stamps. You can't get cash if you don't have children in your home. You can get Medicaid and you can get food assistance, but no cash. So you can't pay your rent. So going back to what I was saying earlier about that substantial risk of harm standard, I'm not suggesting a standard. That's actually the law. The problem, though, in courts is that they don't actually apply the law. And what Professor Sankaran says all of the time is that we have great law here in Michigan. We even have really good Department of Health and Human Services policies that promote keeping children with family and expediting their return home, but it's not applied. The courts in child welfare tend to treat each case as the last one that it saw. And the lawyers don't really use the law. They argue what I would describe as a best interest scenario, rather than actually citing the law and requiring the court to apply the law. Because if the law is actually applied, there would be far fewer removals. And even the court might assert jurisdiction over the children so that the court can keep a watchful eye, but could still keep the children in the home and not remove the children while supervising. So I would just say that we just need to be vigilant, especially as a legal community, to ensure that those legal standards are actually applied. And I think that would go a long way in addressing the family disruption problem that starts that downward spiral to homelessness and loss of housing.
So we have time for one or two questions, if there are questions from the audience.
Hey, so I wanted to tie back to, because I think it was a really potent metaphor or sort of analog that you brought in, was comparing displacement in the foster system to chattel slavery. And that in combination with the discussion of housing sort of made me synthesize everything that was going on into a greater project with cooperation by the state of a bunch of sort of like para-state entities, basically to make money on the backs of the exploitation and disintegration of communities of color. And the thing that seems really difficult to me is that this is in the context of, I mean, this is like a legal symposium, this is at a law school, but that seems like a broader problem or something that's more structural or can't be addressed by policy, because it is really this like greater sort of systemic problem where the state is directly participating in and abetting the capitalist exploitation of communities of color in a way that allows like many vultures, like people who are existing within the foster system, to make $152,000 by pulling people out of working class communities, or landlords who are exploiting communities of color that exist in areas where Section 8 is broadly used and are able to maintain substandard housing or housing at above the market rate, where they're basically extracting a rent from the fact that they're working in a community of color. So as someone who has a more erotic perspective, I think I was wondering sort of like how you address that tension between being someone who operates on the legal side of things and is having to address this broader problem of the exploitation of communities of color, and then what your solution would be in a legal or non-legal context to this huge thing.
I'll take a shot at that. That's actually a question I really struggled with at the beginning of my career. I think for me the answer was that we live in this world right now, and what I can do right now with the skills that I have right now is go into court every time that I can and defend these people using the existing law, which actually ties into a solution that I should have said earlier, but I didn't say because it was so obvious to me, was that one of the solutions is a public right to counsel for civil cases, especially these types of civil cases that have someone's home on the line or someone's child on the line. And that's something that some cities are already imposing. New York City, I think, did that last year. There's a ballot initiative in San Francisco to accomplish that now. So there are ways that, there's ways to hold back the floodgates in the current system. But I agree that broader, more systemic change is needed. And as a direct services provider and practitioner, I think I can offer my experience to people doing that in addition to serving communities directly.
I mean, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I also, starting at the beginning of what you said, I think don't be afraid to think that it could be slavery again, because I think that there's a lot of parallels to what's happening in the child welfare system that are very similar to slavery. And so when you really I want people to be critical of the laws that they are seeing right now. Let's consider the fact that the Hyde Amendment doesn't cover abortions for Medicaid recipients. Let's consider the fact that Medicaid recipients, by definition, are poor women. Let's consider the fact that poor women, then by definition in intersectionality, are a lot of low-income women of color. Let's also then understand that there are caps and family caps to public assistance in many states, depending on how many children that you have. So you have pronatalist states and antinatalist states, and you have about 5 states, one of which is Maryland, which says, okay, we will fund your therapeutic abortions, and we will not limit your public assistance on if you have more than 3 children. That's 5 states in the country. So what that really means is that Black women, low-income women, are very often not given the same choice to have abortions. And I'm not saying that we should be saying that poor people can't procreate, but then we're also saying that they choose to procreate and they choose to have more children, or just choose to have sex. Let's just be really realistic about it. If they have more children, they're going to be capped because they are poor to receive financial benefits. But then how are they going to be able to care for those children because they do not have the same amount of cash assistance to continue to have that? And that is happening to low-income women. Then if they do, quote unquote, catch a case, an ACS case, as soon as they catch a case, their name goes on a registry. That registry stops them from having employment in certain areas or taking care of their future children. So now they are branded in a list. If that case, which is a preponderance of the evidence, a civil standard, where they're not always guaranteed a lawyer in many states, especially not at the beginning and challenging of the removal phase, which many states don't allow you to have a lawyer to challenge the removal of your child, and your child is removed and your child is in foster care. Once your child is placed into foster care, then any other child thereafter, you have, in most states, a less likely chance, almost an immediate chance that anytime you have a child, you will be flagged as neglectful, which means that therefore your uterus has now become a ward of the state, because now, forevermore, because of all of those intersections of systems, any child you have after that will trigger a red flag in the government to come interrogate you at the hospital or foster care to get involved. And then when you think about the logical extension of that, from the womb to foster care, from foster care to prison, and what we know about foster care and prison being an economic basis of America, and we are creating those children as women of color, it's not so far off. And so you have to interrogate how all of those systems are really working together. And they are successfully working together to create an economy off the backs of Black and brown women, children in our society.
And I would only add very quickly that I want to make clear, because I recognize that everyone doesn't understand how the foster care system works. Child Protective Services is the state. Foster care, however, are private agencies contracted by the state in most instances. So they have to abide by the state agencies' policies, but it's almost like the fox guarding the hen house because the state agency is such a bureaucracy. They're not really looking, they're not doing that scrutiny that's required to ensure that these private agencies aren't running amok. And I think that that's a place to start.
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop here because there's another panel after this one. But thank me for joining. Join me in thanking our panelists for participating in this panel. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Obama. You too.